For those who don't know me, I have a problem with the way the word circular causality is being used in cybernetics and system science, and so I decided to make that the focal point of my presentation. But in essence, what I'm doing is I'm reporting out on an ongoing conversation I have with Loet about George Spencer Brown's chicken scratch. And I use the name chicken scratch to really zoom in on this particular symbol and the fact that George says, draw a distinction. And um, the point I'm trying to drive home is this is discursive knowledge. And so that Loet was not correct in saying that there is a problem with George Spencer Brown, that if there is a problem somewhere, it's with Luhmann, but not with George Spencer Brown. And thus I developed my entire presentation around pointing out the passages in which Loet makes that statement that there's something wrong with George Spencer Brown. But then my presentation became too long, so I shortened it extremely. And so I just get to the take-home message that I get from George Spencer Brown after studying him for a year. Dus the chicken scratch is the observable sign signifying the distinction between the observable and the forever unobservable. And dus the photon and the electron are a prototypical constructs of the forever unobservable today, but like 1,000 years ago, it were the gods and the wind and all sorts of demons and devils and Satan. But dus the take-home message is that there's something called forever unobservable, and we better talk about it because it's we reify it every single day with a variety of metaphors. And why just not address, hey, we're using metaphors, and every metaphor has a plus and a minus. And so the metaphor that I'm going to problematize today is just the Ouroboros or circular causality. And whenever I see that signal, I'm thinking of a scholar locked inside in his mind, incapable of seeing how they are perceived by others. And I say this as someone coming from strategic management. These managers, they get evaluated 360 degrees by everyone with whom they work. So there's this ability to have a conversation about your own blind spots and how others see them, that should not be a problem. And so this what I'm trying to get at with Ouroboros is actually that I believe, or what this metaphor does is it makes people like focus on the wrong thing, and as a result they don't see what's in front of their nose. And the person who really exemplifies this thinking is Heinz von Förster, who had actually a separate section in his paper where he shows a blind spot and how the blind spot works. And he goes on to talk about metaphor. So you would think that he's going to have this discourse about how to use metaphors to discover the blind spot in your own thinking and to draw attentions to all the linkages to other literatures on metaphor. But instead he keeps on going on and on and on about the computational theory of the mind. And so now I'm going to try to rush to make sure I don't do more than 10 minutes. So what I see as a problem today is what the cyberneticians, or specifically Gregory Bateson, calls schismogenesis. There's a runaway positive feedback loop in which binary metaphors are treated as literal truths of something. And so we have good and evil, but now today we have also communist and capitalism, and we have left and right and Democrat and Republican and conservative and progressive, and so there you just pick your dialogue and you have your binary metaphor. And then okay, now sorry. So dus in practice it is a vicious circle of argument as war, and dus literally today I think every single one of us at least for 5 minutes is attacking something, so that we are inside this metaphor. And so if as the academy we want to remain relevant and be part of the solution, then we need to come clean with how we have been actively promoting binary metaphors and what we can do to correct that action. And um, this one way to do that is to promote what I call the roundtable model of interdisciplinary research. So I'm not saying that you have to do a roundtable in some poor neighborhood where people are frustrated. I'm talking about the academy needs to think about now, how do we do interdisciplinary research, and um, and is our interdisciplinary research model actually helping us listen to each other, how we all use metaphors, and how each one of us carries a piece of the puzzle, how the metaphor becomes a solution or the metaphor becomes a problem. And so dus the proposed plan of action and basically is dus the flesh and blood academics, and I'm using flesh and blood as a reference to metaphors in the flesh of Lakoff and Johnson, but also to say I'm not talking about some artificial intelligence. I'm talking about people and thinking differently. That is, stop thinking of the computational theory as some sort of Nietzschean Superman that's going to solve all the problems, but instead think of it together with dramaturgical metaphors. And this is a reference to Irving Goffman's work, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, who is being recognized as someone working with these dramaturgical metaphors. And again, I'm not saying you have to kill the computational metaphor. It's just you have to learn to say, this is a metaphor, and now let me try a different one. And so the value of the dramaturgical metaphor is it allows to talk about gestalt switching as you keep the stage, the same action on the stage, but you change the backdrop. And this is some very important element in Laws of Form of George Spencer Brown. And for those who don't are not on top of it, Walter Tydek wrote a splendid paper dus explaining this. And so, dus what the dramaturgical metaphor helps us do is actually do the round table attitude towards interdisciplinary research about how we all work with metaphors, because it makes us kind of, it allows us to switch or do an effort to switch in the mind of the other person on the table. And that is something the computational metaphor cannot do, because that metaphor say there is one program and you better execute it. So it doesn't allow to say it's the wrong program, because a computer who switches gestalts gets destroyed. I mean, that is a computer that is hacked. There is no one going to say that is normal. So the computational metaphor is not helpful here. Now, how can I use Loet's book to do this? He actually shows a solution and the problem, because I cannot help but see a double bind in him. And that he at the same time is talking about discursive knowledge, but is also trying to somehow say that he needs to use the computational metaphor and computational language to do his research. But then his research is also telling us in some way that that metaphor is just an ordinary metaphor, and that there's so much more going on that was implied by the computational metaphor, and especially this process of reification. And that is very clear in chapter 8, where you kind of see two parts. This one where he really engages with Popper and picks up very important elements from Popper. Then in the other part, he starts talking all mathematical as if that is a necessity. And so now to go back to the double bind is this: Heinz von Förster kind of created it on constructing a reality, just by never saying this is a metaphor and these are the limitations. And then why again this is so should be something of concern to cyberneticians is that Gregory Bateson was the one who gave the lexicon to discuss the double bind. So to really make us understand. But now I don't know whether I'm going in uncharted or familiar territory. Jacques Derrida is actually the scholar who really pointed out that the source of the double bind is that we don't know how to talk about difference. And so we need a lexicon to discuss difference. Sorry, I'm going one slide. And once we start thinking of difference, then we see that our troubles start dus in the 18th century, I think, with Leibniz and his writings on the so-called law of identity, dus by turning it into a law, so now everyone needs to do it. And so he complicates our human conversation with difference. And so dus for Loet to contribute to that conversation, there needs to be a friendly engagement and not a critical engagement with laws of form. Because actually what laws of form shows us is the corruption in mathematics, philosophy, and logic, because of theorizing or due to theorizing that everything must be identical to itself. And so dus the ultimate model of identity is the electron. Dus, there are electrons running around in my body, they're running around in the computer, and now they're running around in the head of Loet as we speak. And so we have like visions of the universe coming in existence as a burst of electrons, and we're kind of stuck in thinking of an electron as a particle or a wave, instead of saying, are there other ways to think about an electron? I mean, what are we missing? I mean, this Kuhn's normal science, so to say. And so George Spencer Brown, for me, with his injunction, draw a distinction, is actually walking the talk of the writings of Derrida by saying, draw a distinction. I mean, that's the way civilization started, by some apes or Neanderthals or hominids or whatever they're called. They started drawing a distinction and not thinking of it as a sign signifying something else. And then they further worked with this idea, and so they switched gestalts from just looking at bird to suddenly seeing a sign, and then imagine something else. And so I make a connection with George Spencer Brown and the triangle of reference of Ogden and Richard, because I very carefully read the introduction. And in the introduction, George Spencer Brown is very clearly talking with at least 10 distinctions and not just one. So what he does in the book is he just gives a model of one distinction, but what he does in action is he uses 10 distinctions. And so the triangle of reference and laws of form together gives a productive model to work with distinctions. And so then the great irony becomes clear that if you read Leibniz carefully, he actually was talking about indiscernible difference. So he was talking about the unobservable. And what do you do when you're not sure whether it's the same thing? So he never started like saying, here is my law of identity. That's something that was done afterwards. So now there's the condition to really get in this new paradigm. I mean, that is that we really need to begin thinking very critical about the word circular causality. So I'm not saying it's all negative and it needs to be deleted from every textbook. I'm just saying we cannot just accept it at face value. And we need to treat it as an ordinary metaphor that's used in a particular situation and treat it accordingly. And then in order to do that, actually, is we need to transform ourselves in a manner that everyone gets access to the literature on metaphors, so that we all become literate when it comes to talking about metaphors, and that it's not the exclusive domain of a philosopher or someone in cognitive psychology or the linguist, and that everyone else just needs to listen to what that other person say. And now, very quickly, my last slides is this: how when you apply this reasoning, thinking about distinctions to Lutz's work. So here is this communicating communicators, but I can also set it up as a schema, just with containers and making distinctions and pointing out there is reading and writing going on. And then I can bring in Karl Popper's three-world hypothesis in a schematic form. And then from there, I make it all into like topical topics. And then from making it all in topics for particular disciplines, I kind of turn it into a round table model that I kind of see in the work of Loet, um, like in the subtext, but I don't see it clearly yet. And this concludes my presentation.